Hi everybody, I'm Clare. If you're new around here, then I'm part of the team here. It's good to be with you, and I'm going to just be unpacking a little bit around the idea of growth in the desert, but particularly that idea of what do we do when we're trying to follow God and it feels like he's absent or gone silent, gone mute. And I guess that if we could sort of do a bit of a poll in the room, I guess that most people would say that they've experienced times in their life when, even as somebody who might have been following God for a long time, following Jesus for years, there might have been times in your life when it feels like God's gone a bit silent on you. And the presence of God isn't quite what it used to feel like. Maybe you've had a few mountaintops in your experience, and you could even put a date on some of them. Possibly you're somebody who came to God because your life felt empty and arid and dry, and you thought, I've got to go on a search for something, for some meaning, for some purpose. And you ended up here or in church looking for nourishment, for something for life. You were thirsty. We've all been thirsty the last few weeks, haven't we? I mean, goodness me, thirsty. And there's nothing quite like drinking water when you're thirsty, is it? Is there? And if you're a gardener, like I am, then don't you, that water is life in that garden. And without the water, look at our lawns. England's green and pleasant land is sort of brown and a bit crunchy at the moment, isn't it? And we're in a bit of a drought, and water is life, isn't it? And so when we hear that promise of Jesus that says, if you're thirsty, come to me and drink, and I'll give you the water of life. Not only will I give you water enough to quench your thirst, he says, I'm going to make a spring of water come out of you for the world. That sounds really good, doesn't it? And it sounds like the answer for a drought time. And we want to say that it's true. And that's why we sing those songs. We reaffirm what is true. And sometimes we're not always completely there, are we? We're saying the words, or we might be singing them thinking, I kind of know this is true, but right now it doesn't completely feel like I'm there. And so I just want to talk into that a little bit today. The idea of, as Dave said, the growth in the desert places, growth in the desert. What do we do when God feels absent? Can we find the presence? How do we even understand those desert places? My kids sort of mock that phrase a little bit, desert place, in our family, because they think Christians use it all too easily. Like everything they do when things aren't going so well, they're kind of like they're in a desert place. So if I stub my toe or I burn a cake or something like that, they go, what's that, Mum, desert place? So we don't want to be too trite about those things. We want to recognize that actually it's really hard for us human beings to be stuck in a place where we feel unable to hear God's voice or unable to sense his presence. It's hard, and it's a very human experience. And we're going to look at Psalm 13 now, which is King David writing this psalm. And it feels like when you read it, he's in a bit of a desert place himself. He begins the psalm with a kind of desert cry. How long is it going to be like this? And he ends it with something else entirely. It's a short psalm. We're going to look at it now. And let's just be thinking about that idea. Maybe think about where you're at now. Does it feel to you like sermons are kind of like popping with energy as you're listening to them? Or are they a bit like, oh, another sermon? Or, the songs, are you going through the motions a little bit? Do you feel like you've got that sense of the presence of God? Let's listen to what King David is saying in this Psalm 13. So he starts by saying, how long, Lord? How long? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My hope is in your salvation. Can't see it from there. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. So it begins in a bleak place, doesn't it? And it ends somewhere else altogether. And I'm just going to draw out 3 really simple ideas for maybe if you're somebody who you feel a bit stuck. Do you feel stuck at the moment? Do you feel like you're in a bit of a dry place? Maybe that's you. If you're not, I just want to say to you, pick up some clues here, because there are people around you who are, and they need you. And one of the things that God gives us to refresh us is the community of the Spirit, the people around us. We're meant to refresh each other. So, first of all, David says, how long? And he says it really emphatically. It's kind of like he's encouraging us to ask the question, what's wrong here? Where are you? How long is it going to be like this? Have you forgotten me? How long is it going to be like this? And he speaks about this torment of wrestling with his anxious thoughts and a feeling of sorrow in his heart, a feeling like there's an enemy that's going to have the final word, that's going to say, that's going to rejoice if he falls. Now, who of us has felt like that? Lots of us, I think. I certainly have. Times when you sort of think, wow, this is going on too long, this particular period of time, and I don't seem to have what it takes to move myself out of this situation. And perhaps you're in that today, exactly that place. And I want to just ask the question, why doesn't God just come and solve it? Why not just come in? We know that he can do that. We know that if he was to come and refresh us, he could do that. But why doesn't he? I just want to just pose the question, really, why doesn't he? And I'm kind of wondering whether we can see that there is something going on behind the scenes in a time of spiritual dryness when God seems absent, that is important too, that is part of the whole experience of being a follower of God. Just a few months ago, as lots of you know, I was in hospital and very ill. And for 2 weeks I was ill. But the first week I was very ill. And, maybe one night even, really on the edge of, dying. And in those 5-6 days of that, it was a strange time. It was a bit of a shadowy time. So I was kind of not fully conscious most of the time. And it felt dark a lot of the time. And it was very hard. But a lot of people have said to me, in that time, what was the kind of moment you had with God? What was God like? It's sort of, surely he showed up and you had this great epiphany during that time. Did God kind of really come and almost make up for the darkness by turning up extra bright at some point? And I'm afraid I just disappointed so many people, I think, when they've asked me that question, because it wasn't like that at all. I mean, it was a strange and empty time in many ways. It didn't feel like God was not in existence, not at all. But it just didn't feel like he was particularly in the room, if I'm really honest. It just felt flat and quiet and dark. And one of the things I really remember is this raging thirst. Every night, all night, I just wanted to drink water, and I couldn't seem to get enough water in me. I'm sure there's all sorts of medical reasons for that, but it's a strange old time. And I found myself praying and saying to God, are you there? That was probably the main thing I kept saying. Are you there? And maybe that's been like that for you at different times. Maybe it's like that right now. You're in the middle of something, and your main question is, are you there? Where are you? And how long is this got to be like this? Because actually it feels to me like something potentially could defeat me in this moment unless something changes. I know I need water. I know I need to move. And King David is in exactly that place. And I think that one of the things that happens in the desert is it is a very stark place. It is not a place where, you can easily reach out for something to keep you pep you up in the moment. It's a stark place. The desert is a place of death. The wilderness is a place where there isn't life springing up all the time. And when rain comes to the wilderness, we see life coming. But we see that absolute absence of its own power to regenerate itself. And the Israelites were like that. The children of Israel, they were led through the desert for 40 years. And that's what you see in their experience. You see God leading them. And you see all sorts of stuff come up to the surface in the desert that wasn't necessarily obvious in their previous existence. All sorts of moaning and all sorts of weakness, all sorts of vulnerability emerges in the desert. And maybe that is something of what it's about. Is it possible that God is not absent at all, but present in a different way, even when it seems empty, when it seems dry? Because something has to emerge in us. Sometimes we are the ones who have to see what is in us. Because God knows, by his Spirit, he knows everything that is in us. But do we know? Do we understand ourselves? And I think the desert place is something of that. It's that place of the emerging of all the different things that are in us that are kind of wrestling for supremacy. One of the things that we might recognize is that in our attempt to cope with life and all that it throws at us, there's kind of like a fine line between resilience and toughness. Do you recognize what I'm saying? That if you repeatedly experience difficulties, some people seem to emerge out of repeated trials with this kind of resilience that is heartening to be around and refreshing, actually. There are people amongst us, even sitting next to you now, who you would be able to say, that is true of you. I've seen you go through repeated trials, but there's this beautiful resilience that is in you. It's not hardness and toughness. You're not like a weather-beaten Christian who's just, going on, but actually you've got this kind of freshness in you. So that's possible in times of struggle. But another thing is possible, isn't it? A kind of shutting down and a hardening at times in order to cope. It's such a natural thing to do, to kind of close off your emotions and just beat against the darkness and keep pushing on. But the problem is that in our coping strategies is this kind of toughness and a hardness of heart, and it can end up with us being a bit hardened in life to the people around us. We might even recognize that in us today. I've become a bit tough, a bit compassion fatigued, a bit unimpressed with all this spiritual talk. And that can happen to us. And those coping strategies can end up shaping us for years. We become them a little bit. And so the desert is this place of this dry place where some of those things emerge and you start to realize, is this me? And David, instead of staying in that place, he kind of pushes on to a second place. He pushes on in this psalm. And instead of just saying, what are you going to do, God? What are you going to do, God? He moves on. And I want to just encourage you to see a little 3-step process here if you're stuck. And the first step is that, being honest with God. This is what it's like. How long is it going to be like this? I am tired and I am dry. But David moves on and he starts to ask God for something. Now, you might ask for refreshment. You might ask, come, Holy Spirit, make me feel again the mountaintop that I had before. Because remember how good it was, how evangelistic I was then? Remember how I could help my neighbor and feel compassion? Take me to the mountaintop again. Water me, God. But David doesn't really ask for that. He's asked this. He says, look on me. Look at me. That's an interesting thing to say when you're stuck and you know you need water. Do we have the nerve to say to God, in that place of aridness and dryness, when we're seeking his presence, to say, okay, look at me then? I think David's sort of saying, show me if there's anything here that is stopping me from moving out of this place. That is a hard question to ask when you're at a low ebb. And I want to say it compassionately. I'm not saying it would sort yourself out. I'm saying when you're in the lowest place, the driest place, and you want out of there, maybe the right question to ask is there anything here in me that needs to go, that needs to die in the desert place? That's a hard question. But David's asking, he says, look on me. Give me light to my eyes. And the way he's talking, the words he's using are kind of like an explanation. They mean, give me revelation. Give me guidance. Give me revelation. Give me not just your presence, not just an emotional replenishing, but give me some revelation here to move me on from that place. So what would that be for you today? In the place you're at, we can all ask that question of God. Come to me by the Spirit and give me some revelation. What do you want to show in me? And that's really what I think David is asking. And it's a place of battle still. You know, he's asking that question. He's saying, unless you show me, the enemy will triumph. And this is a reality for us as followers of Jesus, is that it is a battle behind the scenes. It's not just a kind of level playing field. There is an enemy. The Bible speaks of an enemy who wants to crush us. And it's a vulnerable place to be in that place and actually say, God, show me if there's anything there. And there's loads that we can do. You know, Paul in Acts says, repent to the people he's speaking to, and times of refreshing will come. Sometimes what God shows us is something that needs to go, a change of mind. Other times what God might show us is that you've been living out of disappointment. You're not expecting anything to happen because of that disappointment somewhere way back in the past. And this stuff starts to show up in the starkness of the desert because God is after moving us on. He is present doing something behind the scenes, and I want to encourage you to see it in that way. One of the things that in the hospital, what I felt, like I said, I didn't feel a sense of the presence of God. I wasn't chatting away, feeling like, oh, here you are, let's go through this together. It didn't feel like that. And I began to sort of reach out. And the only thing I could think of doing in my kind of muddled state was to say Psalm 23, because I knew it off by heart. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He'll lead me into green pastures. He'll restore my soul. I was kind of saying, I hope that's true. You know, even if I go through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. For your rod and staff will comfort me. And in the presence of my enemy, I'll sit down and eat. And I recited it to myself over and over again because I had to dip into something that wasn't a present reality. It wasn't an emotional reality. It was something out of my history. A few nights ago, I was with some of the prayer ministers from this church, a group of 20 or so, some of the people that meet up to pray with people and process stuff that is going on. And it was a lovely evening. And one of the things that we were doing was just sharing stories of how we had been sustained over the years. And I just listened to story after story of these men and women just saying, that was a hard time, but I had to trust God for that. And I did this, I read that Bible verse, and that became my mantra. I just said that Bible verse over and over again. Or I prayed with that person, and they really stuck by me. And there was this sense in the room of just this kind of wisdom that had accumulated over the years. And it wasn't a picture of a fluffy picture, you know, of ease at all. It was a picture of person after person who'd been through trial after trial, but somehow something had emerged in them, a resilience, a beautiful, fresh resilience that comes from a history of trusting God that was quite striking. And I felt, I felt like it was the treasure that is often not seen, in the kind of more showy sides of church life or Christian life. It's often not seen, the kind of accumulated treasure of walking with God week in, week out, through trial and suffering and struggle, and getting there into a place of of trusting God and believing that he's still there. And so I just dipped into my history with God. Psalm 23 was part of it. And I didn't feel particularly, like I said, this great refreshing stream, but I began to move gradually as I came out of hospital, and, a few weeks went by, and, it felt flat for a while, and it was a very slow and imperceptible recovery, imperceptibly slow recovery at times, a feeling of, I said to Dave at one point, I was preaching at Easter on the resurrection, I said, I don't know if I've got anything in me. It felt like it was running on empty. But slowly but surely, the presence of God began to rise up in me again and began to be felt around me. I depended on the prayers of the people around me. So if you're in a refreshed place, your prayers for others who are not refreshed are so vital. But when I wrote that on my notes, I was dependent on the prayers of others. It kind of auto-spell checked and rearranged itself into dependent on the repairer. And that is true too. The thing that I really came out of that time with was this sense of, unless God mends me, unless he restores me, unless he sends me refreshing, I cannot generate it from within myself. It just isn't in there. I need you, God. And my sense of my need for him was important for me because I'm a resilient person and I can cope on dry for a long time. But I need to know, and you need to know, that without God there is no life. Just like without water, there is no life. And that is probably in many ways, the purpose of the desert is to come to that place again, and maybe again and again, of saying, God, without you, the whole thing is just dust. But when you are there, life springs up in me, and I am utterly dependent on you for that life. And so David ends that psalm with that. Really, he says, but I trust. I trust in your goodness. He says, I trust in the goodness, I praise the goodness of God. He looks back into his history and says, I've seen that you've been there, God. And I trust in your love. I choose it. And sometimes, there is one thing we can do. We can't regenerate ourselves, and we can't feel something that doesn't feel like it's present, but we can do something. And we can choose to trust. And we can say, God, because I believe you're good, I've seen your goodness, I will see it again in the land of the living, as David says in another psalm. I'll see your goodness in the land of the living. It is ahead of me, and so I'll choose to trust. Maybe that's your place today. Maybe you're in that place that's a bit arid and dry, and you can't feel the presence of God. And I just say to you, there's a doorway out of this place. It's like a stepping stone, a doorway out of this place, and it will have that little door, little name over it. Trust. Can you trust God that he is good unfailingly, and he will be there in the future? Those are the three things that come out of that psalm for me. Just that sense of it's important to be honest. Say it how it is. Ask the right question. Be careful what you ask for. Don't just ask for a refreshing experience. Ask, is there anything in the way of me moving on to a greater experience of you from this? And then say, God, anyway, I trust in you. And that's what I saw in the room, in my lounge on Wednesday night, was a group of people who had repeatedly done that final step, saying, but I trust you, but I trust you. And what grows out of that is this amazing sense of accumulated history with God that is a beautiful thing to see, and that is what God is after. Maybe even in the desert place, that's what he's after in you today, to craft in you this great sense of accumulated history of trust, even in the times of difficulty. And, I felt, sometimes we say, let's be strong in God. Learn how to be strong in God. And the trouble is, there's all sorts of pitfalls even in that idea of us being toughened and hardened and trying to be strong, trying to make ourselves strong. But actually the desert place is probably not a place for saying how to be strong in God, more how for him to be strong in us, because that is what emerges when those things are cleared out of the way, is the strength of God, the presence of God in the people. That's where it comes from when Jesus says, I'll give you the water of the Spirit and it'll come out of you like a stream. That's how it comes out. You take it in. It becomes part of your flesh. You trust God. And then out of you comes the streams of living water for the world. So, I'm going to pray. Thank you, God, for the great gift of meaning and purpose in this life that we lead. Thank you that you are present. And even in your absence, we want to say that we choose to see that you are present and at work in a different way. I pray for everybody here who today feels a sense of the absence of God. I pray, Jesus, for revelation, for an eye-opening revelation, for your sight to be given to us, for us to see where you are at work and what needs to be done. Help us to surrender to your gracious hand and your work. In Jesus' name, amen.